She had it all: beauty, fame, and a career most could only dream of. Maggie Rizer was one of the top supermodels of the early 2000s. Her face graced the covers of Vogue, walked the most prestigious runways, and landed million-dollar deals with brands like Gucci and Versace. Behind her smile was a young woman who worked hard, stayed grounded, and trusted deeply, especially when it came to her own family. But that trust would become her biggest downfall. At the height of her career, Maggie was earning millions. She was smart, careful, and never one to chase flashy headlines. Yet somehow, all of her savings, over $7 million, vanished. Gone. And the person responsible? Not a stranger, not a scam artist, but someone from within her own home. Someone she thought would protect her no matter what. As Maggie continued to light up the fashion world, behind the scenes, a quiet betrayal was unfolding. The kind of betrayal that doesn't just break bank accounts, it breaks hearts. Her rise was fast, her fame global, but what was happening in her personal life was something no camera ever captured. This isn't just the story of a supermodel losing money. It's a story about trust, family, and how even the strongest people can be blindsided by those closest to them. How does someone go from millions in the bank to starting over from scratch? How do you face the world after being betrayed so deeply, and so publicly? Maggie Rizer's story isn't just shocking, it's deeply human. And it's far from over. In the next part, we dive into the painful moment she discovered the truth, and the man behind the mask. Maggie Rizer was born into a world far from the flashing lights of fashion. Raised in upstate New York, she grew up in a modest home with a tight-knit family. Her stepfather, John Breen, played a major role in her life. To the outside world, he seemed supportive, stable, even proud of Maggie's sudden rise in the modeling world. When Maggie's natural beauty caught the eye of scouts in the late 90s, her life transformed almost overnight. She went from a small-town girl to one of the most in-demand faces in the industry. But success didn't change her core. She stayed humble, grounded, and close to her family, especially John, who she believed had her best interests at heart. As her earnings skyrocketed, Maggie did something many young stars fail to do: she trusted her finances to someone she knew. Someone she loved. She handed over control to her stepfather, making him the manager of her money, thinking she was protecting her future. What could go wrong? The truth is, Maggie never saw the warning signs. While she focused on her career, flying between Paris and New York, attending fittings, and shooting campaigns, John had full access to every dollar she earned. Maggie thought her money was being invested wisely. She imagined savings, a home, security for the future. But behind the scenes, her stepfather was leading a very different life. Quietly, over the years, he was moving money out, draining her accounts, spending it in ways she would never have imagined. There were no dramatic outbursts, no sudden crashes. Just small decisions, bad investments, and secrets buried in spreadsheets she never saw. Maggie continued modeling, unaware that her entire financial foundation was crumbling. As the years passed, the illusion held up. Maggie was still traveling the world, still seen as a success story. But eventually, the numbers stopped adding up. Something felt off. She started asking questions, small at first. Why wasn't there more in her account? Where were her investment reports? And every time, there were answers. Reassurances. Just enough to keep the questions quiet. Until one day, the truth could no longer hide. A single phone call shattered everything she thought she knew about her life, her success, and the man she called Dad. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. Maggie had just wrapped up a shoot in Los Angeles when her phone buzzed with a message from her accountant, someone she'd rarely spoken to directly before. His tone was calm, but what he said shook her to the core. "We need to talk. There are some discrepancies in your financial records." At first, she didn't panic. Maybe a clerical error. A mix-up with taxes. Something that could be fixed. But as she sat down with the paperwork, the numbers painted a terrifying story. Her savings were nearly gone. The investments? Fake. Accounts she thought existed had been drained, one by one. At the center of it all was John Green. Maggie couldn't believe it. This was the man who raised her. The man who cheered for her at Fashion Week. The one who picked her up from the airport and said he was proud. But according to the documents, he'd been stealing from her for years. Not just little by little, but methodically, covering his tracks, forging documents, lying with a straight face. She felt sick. Not just because of the money, but because of the betrayal. Trust, once broken in that way, doesn't just hurt, it rewrites everything. As she quietly tried to piece together what had happened, she found herself caught between two versions of reality. The one she believed in for years, and the one staring back at her in black and white numbers. There were things she didn't understand. Trips John had taken without telling the family. A sudden interest in expensive real estate. Loans in her name that she never signed for. She started digging deeper, calling lawyers, financial experts, even friends from back home. Everyone had stories, but no one had answers. While Maggie kept up her public image, inside she was unraveling. Friends noticed she had grown quiet. Withdrawn. She stopped booking work. Not because the fashion world turned its back on her, but because she didn't know who she could trust anymore. How do you face the spotlight when your life feels like it's collapsing behind the curtain? Still, she didn't go public. Not yet. The full truth hadn't come out. And part of her hoped, desperately, that maybe, somehow, this was all a mistake. But deep down, she knew what was coming. Something far worse than she was ready to admit. Maggie Rizer couldn't sleep. Each night felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the truth she was uncovering grew with every unanswered question. Her mind raced through every memory of her stepfather, birthdays, family dinners, late-night talks after shows. She replayed his words, his smiles, wondering which ones were real and which were just part of the lie. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. The man who had walked her down red carpets was the same man who had been quietly erasing her future from behind the scenes. The deeper she dug, the worse it got. Her financial advisor showed her more files, more transfers. Accounts Maggie never knew existed. Assets signed away without her consent. Some accounts had been opened using fake signatures. When she confronted John, his calm voice didn't match the fear in her chest. He claimed he was managing things, that she was too busy to handle the details. But there was no avoiding the facts anymore. He had stolen from her, lied to her face, and let her live in a false sense of security while he spent her earnings as if they were his. At the same time, Maggie faced pressure from all sides. The fashion industry kept calling, but she wasn't ready to go back. Her name was still valuable, but her spirit was broken. Behind the glossy headlines, she was fighting a silent battle, unsure of who she could turn to. Some friends urged her to go public, to expose everything. Others warned her to keep quiet, to avoid scandal. But every day she waited, the anger grew stronger, and so did the pain. Lawyers began preparing for the next steps. Paperwork, statements, evidence, it all pointed in one direction. Maggie was preparing for a legal showdown with her own stepfather. And yet, despite everything, a small part of her still hoped for a different ending. Maybe he would confess. Maybe he would make it right. But that hope was fading fast. Her $7 million was gone. Her trust shattered. And the man who once stood at the center of her family now felt like a stranger. As the day of confrontation approached, tension gripped every corner of her life. She wasn't just fighting for money, she was fighting for the truth. And soon, the whole world would know what had really happened behind the glamorous life of Maggie Rizer. Just when Maggie Rizer thought she had uncovered the full extent of the betrayal, another discovery made everything even worse. While working closely with her legal team, one of the investigators flagged a new set of transactions, ones that weren't just about stolen funds, but tied to Maggie's name in ways that could damage her forever. It turned out her stepfather hadn't just been siphoning off money. He had been using her identity to secure loans, take out credit, and invest in shady businesses. Some of these ventures had failed miserably, and now creditors were beginning to ask questions. The legal mess wasn't just about recovering lost money, it was about protecting her reputation. Maggie felt sick reading the details. There were properties she didn't own, business ventures she'd never heard of, and debts she didn't incur. All of it carried her signature, faked, of course, but the damage was real. What she feared most was now happening. Her name, her brand, and everything she'd worked for was being pulled into a scandal she never asked for. And if things weren't handled carefully, she could be held liable for debts she had no part in creating. The legal team scrambled to put out fires. Maggie's lawyer urged her to stay quiet publicly, while they tried to trace and untangle the financial web. But the pressure was mounting. Journalists had started poking around. Rumors were circulating that something was wrong. Whispers in the fashion world suggested Maggie was in trouble. She knew it was only a matter of time before the headlines came. Behind closed doors, family tensions exploded. Her mother, who had once defended John, was now torn between heartbreak and fury. They barely spoke. Her siblings, once a close support system, were also confused and angry. Some felt ashamed. Others, betrayed. Maggie had never felt more isolated, even when she was surrounded by cameras and fans. But what hit the hardest came from a place she least expected. While combing through records, the investigator revealed that John had begun these activities long before Maggie ever became a household name. In fact, evidence showed that the fraud may have started during her very first modeling contracts, when she was barely out of high school. That meant her entire financial history had been shaped by deception. Everything she thought she earned, every bit of success she believed she was saving for the future, had been touched by someone else's manipulation from the very beginning. It was more than theft now, it was identity theft, emotional abuse, and a systematic dismantling of her independence. The stakes were no longer just financial. Maggie was now fighting to clear her name, protect what little she had left, and somehow reclaim her voice in an industry that only sees what it wants to see. The next step wasn't just legal. It was deeply personal. But before she could make her move, something happened, something she never saw coming. And it would change everything. The thing Maggie Rizer never expected was that the man who had caused so much damage would finally come forward, quietly, without lawyers or press. John Breen, her stepfather, confessed everything in a written statement. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was cold. Just numbers, timelines, and signatures. But for Maggie, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The truth had been buried for years, and now it sat clearly in front of her. He admitted to stealing over $7 million from her, using her identity, and deceiving the entire family. With this confession, Maggie's legal team was finally able to clear her name and protect her from the fallout of his fraudulent debts. The court case moved swiftly after that. John was charged and sentenced, and Maggie was no longer tied to the wreckage she left behind. But no amount of justice could bring back the years she lost or the innocence that was taken from her. Her career had already changed. The modeling world moved on, but Maggie didn't fight to return. She chose peace instead. A quieter life. One where she could control her own narrative, without the flash of cameras or whispers of scandal. In time, she spoke publicly, not to gain sympathy, but to protect others. Her story became more than a headline about a supermodel's fall. It became a warning about trust, money, and the silence that often hides behind fame. Maggie Rizer taught the world that even in the most glamorous lives, darkness can grow quietly. And that reclaiming your power sometimes means starting from zero. She rebuilt, carefully, on her own terms. No managers, no blind trust, no illusions. Just truth. And though the pain never fully disappeared, it became part of her strength. Maggie's story wasn't just about losing $7 million. It was about surviving betrayal and rising with clarity, not just beauty. In the end, she didn't lose herself. She found something stronger.